Good morning. I want to thank everyone for being here today to examine the use of persuasive technologies on Internet platforms. Each of our witnesses today has a great deal of expertise with respect to the use of artificial intelligence and algorithms more broadly, as well as in the more narrow context of engagement and persuasion, and brings unique perspectives to these matters. Your participation in this important hearing is appreciated, particularly as this committee continues to work on drafting data privacy legislation. I convened this hearing in part to inform legislation that I'm developing that would require Internet platforms to give consumers the option to engage with the platform without having the experience shaped by algorithms driven by user-specific data. Internet platforms have transformed the way we communicate and interact, and they have made incredibly positive impacts on society in ways that are too numerous to count. The vast majority of content on these platforms is innocuous, and at its best, it is entertaining, educational, and beneficial to the public. However, the powerful mechanisms behind these platforms meant to enhance engagement also have the ability, or at least the potential, to influence the thoughts and behaviors of literally billions of people. That is one reason why there is widespread unease about the power of these platforms and why it is important for the public to better understand how these platforms use artificial intelligence and opaque algorithms to make inferences from the reams of data about us that affect behavior and influence outcomes. Without safeguards, such as real transparency, there is a risk that some Internet platforms will seek to optimize engagement to benefit their own interests and not necessarily to benefit the consumer's interests. In 2013, former Google executive chairman Eric Schmidt wrote that modern technology platforms, and I quote, "are even more powerful than most people realize, and our future will be profoundly altered by their adoption and successfulness in societies everywhere," end quote. Since that time, algorithms and artificial intelligence have rapidly become an important part of our lives, largely without us even realizing it. As online content continues to grow, large technology companies rely increasingly on AI-powered automation to select and display content that will optimize engagement. Unfortunately, the use of artificial intelligence and algorithms to optimize engagement can have an unintended and possibly even dangerous downside. In April, Bloomberg reported that YouTube has spent years chasing engagement while ignoring internal calls to address toxic videos, such as vaccination conspiracies and disturbing content aimed at children. Earlier this month, the New York Times reported that YouTube's automated recommendation system was found to be automatically playing a video of children playing in their backyard pool to other users who had watched sexually themed content. That is truly troubling, and it indicates the real risks in a system that relies on algorithms and artificial intelligence to optimize for engagement. And these are not isolated examples. For instance, some have suggested that the so-called filter bubble created by social media platforms like Facebook may contribute to our political polarization by encapsulating users within their own comfort zones or echo chambers. Congress has a role to play in ensuring companies have the freedom to innovate, but in a way that keeps consumers' interests and well-being at the forefront of their progress. While there must be a healthy dose of personal responsibility when users participate in seemingly free online services, companies should also provide greater transparency about how exactly the content we see is being filtered. Consumers should have the option to engage with a platform without being manipulated by algorithms powered by their own personal data, especially if those algorithms are opaque to the average user. We are convening this hearing in part to examine whether algorithmic explanation and transparency are policy options that Congress should be considering. Ultimately, my hope is that at this hearing today, we are able to better understand how Internet platforms use algorithms, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to influence outcomes. And we have a very distinguished panel before us. Today, we are joined by Tristan Harris, the co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology, Ms. Maggie Stanfill, the Director of Google's User Experience, Dr. Stephen Wolfram, founder of Wolfram Research, and Mrs. Rashida Richardson, the Director of Policy Research at the AI Now Institute. Thank you all again for participating on this important topic, and I want to recognize Senator Schatz for any opening remarks that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Social media and other Internet platforms make their money by keeping users engaged, and so they've hired the greatest engineering and tech minds to get users to stay longer inside of their apps and on their websites. They've discovered that one way to keep us all hooked is to use algorithms that feed us a constant stream of increasingly more extreme and inflammatory content. And this content is pushed out with very little transparency or oversight by humans. This setup and also basic human psychology makes us vulnerable to lies, hoaxes, and misinformation. A Wall Street Journal investigation last year found that YouTube's recommendation engine often leads users to conspiracy theories, partisan viewpoints, and misleading videos, even when users aren't seeking out that kind of content. And we saw that YouTube's algorithms were recommending videos of children after users watched sexualized content that did not involve children. And this isn't just a YouTube problem. We saw all of the biggest platforms struggle to contain the spread of videos of the Christchurch massacre and its anti-Muslim propaganda. The shooting was live streamed on Facebook, and over 1 million copies were uploaded across platforms. Many people reported seeing it on autoplay on their social media feeds and not realizing what it was. And just last month, we saw a fake video of the Speaker of the House go viral. I want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing because, as these examples illustrate, something is really wrong here. And I think it's this. Silicon Valley has a premise. It's that society would be better, more efficient, smarter, more frictionless if we would just eliminate steps that include human judgment. But if YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter employees, rather than computers, were making the recommendations, would they have recommended these awful videos in the first place? Now, I'm not saying that employees need to make every little decision, but companies are letting algorithms run wild and only using humans to clean up the mess. Algorithms are amoral. Companies design them to optimize for engagement as their highest priority, and by doing so, they eliminated human judgment as part of their business models. As algorithms take on an increasingly important role, we need for them to be more transparent, and companies need to be more accountable for the outcomes that they produce. Imagine a world where pharmaceutical companies were not responsible for the long-term impacts of their medicine and we couldn't test their efficacy. Or if engineers were not responsible for the safety and structure they design and we couldn't review the blueprints. We are missing that kind of accountability for internet platform companies. Right now, all we have are representative sample sets, data scraping, and anecdotal evidence. These are useful tools, but they are inadequate for the rigorous systemic studies that we need about the societal effects of algorithms. These are conversations worth having because of the significant influence that algorithms have on people's daily lives. And this is a policy issue that will only grow more important as technology continues to advance. And so thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our experts.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. And we do, as I said, have a great panel to hear from today. And we're going to start on my left and your right with Mr. Tristan Harris, who's co-founder and executive director of Center for Humane Technology. Ms. Maggie Stanfield, as I mentioned, who is the Google User Experience Director at Google Inc., Dr. Stephen Wolfram, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Wolfram Research, and Ms. Rashida Richardson, director of policy research at AI Now Institute. So if you would, confine your oral remarks to as close as 5 minutes as possible. It'll give us an opportunity to maximize the chance for members to ask questions. But thank you all for being here. We look forward to hearing from you. Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Senator Thune and Senator Schatz. Everything you said, it's sad to me because it's happening not by accident but by design. Because the business model is to keep people engaged, which in other words, this hearing is about persuasive technology. And persuasion is about an invisible asymmetry of power. When I was a kid, I was a magician. And magic teaches you that you can have asymmetric power without the other person realizing it. You can masquerade to have asymmetric power while looking like you have an equal relationship. You say, pick a card, any card, while meanwhile you know exactly how to get that person to pick the card that you want. And essentially what we're experiencing with technology is an increasing asymmetry of power that's been masquerading itself as an equal or contractual relationship where the responsibility is on us. So let's walk through why that's happening. In the race for attention, because there's only so much attention, companies have to get more of it by being more and more aggressive. I call it the race to the bottom of the brainstem. So it starts with techniques like pull to refresh. So you pull to refresh your newsfeed. That operates like a slot machine. It has the same kind of addictive qualities that keep people in Las Vegas hooked. to the slot machine. Other examples are removing stopping cues. So if I take the bottom out of this glass and I keep refilling the water or the wine, you won't know when to stop drinking. So that's what happens with infinitely scrolling feeds. We naturally remove the stopping cues, and this is what keeps people scrolling. But the race for attention has to get more and more aggressive, and so it's not enough just to get your behavior and predict what will take your behavior. We have to predict how to keep you hooked in a different way. And so it crawled deeper down the brainstem into our social validation. So that was the introduction of likes and followers. How many followers do I have? And that got it was much cheaper to, instead of getting your attention, to get you addicted to getting attention from other people. And this has created the kind of mass narcissism and mass cultural thing that's happening with young people, especially today. And after 2 decades in decline, the mental health of 10 to 14-year-old girls has actually shot up 170% in the last 8 years. And this has been very characteristically the cause of social media. And in the race for attention, it's not enough just to get people addicted to attention. The race has to migrate to AI. Who can build a better predictive model of your behavior? And so if you give an example of YouTube. So there you are, you're about to hit play on a YouTube video, and you hit play, and then you think you're going to watch this one video, and then you wake up 2 hours later and say, oh my God, what just happened? And the answer is because you had a supercomputer pointed at your brain. And at the moment you hit play, it wakes up an avatar voodoo doll-like version of you inside of a Google server. And that avatar, based on all the clicks and likes and everything you've ever made, those are like your hair clippings and toenail clippings and nail filings that make the avatar look and act more and more like you. So that inside of a Google server, they can simulate more and more possibilities. If I prick you with this video, if I prick you with this video, how long would you stay? And the business model is simply what maximizes watch time. This leads to the kind of algorithmic extremism that you've pointed out. And this is what's caused 70% of YouTube's traffic now to be driven by recommendations, not by human choice, but by the machines. And it's a race between Facebook's voodoo doll, where you flick your finger, can they predict what to show you next, and Google's voodoo doll. And these are abstract metaphors that apply to the whole tech industry, where it's a race between who can better predict your behavior. Facebook has something called loyalty prediction, where they can actually predict to an advertiser when you're about to become disloyal to a brand. So if you're a mother and you take Pampers diapers, they can tell Pampers, hey, this user is about to become disloyal to this brand. So in other words, they can predict things about us that we don't know about our own selves. And that's a new level of asymmetric power. And we have a name for this asymmetric relationship, which is a fiduciary relationship or a duty of care relationship, the same standard we apply to doctors, to priests, to lawyers. Imagine a world in which priests only make their money by selling access to the confession booth to someone else. Except in this case, Facebook listens to 2 billion people's confessions, has a supercomputer next to them, and is calculating and predicting confessions you're going to make before you know you're going to make them. And that's what's causing all this havoc. So I'd love to talk about more of these things later. I just want to finish up by saying this affects everyone, even if you don't use these products. You still send your kids to a school where other people believing that anti-vaccine conspiracy theories causes impact for your life, or other people voting in your elections. And when Marc Andreessen said in 2011, the quote was, "Software is going to eat the world." And what he meant by that, Marc Andreessen was the founder of Netscape. What he meant by that was that software can do every part of society more efficiently than non-software, right? Because it's just adding efficiencies. And so we're going to allow software to eat up our elections, we're going to allow it to eat up our media, our taxi, our transportation. And the problem was that software was eating the world without taking responsibility for it. We used to have rules and standards around Saturday morning cartoons, and when YouTube gobbles up that part of society, it just takes away all of those protections. And I just want to finish up by saying that I know Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, testified before this committee 50 years ago, concerned about the animated bombardment that we were showing children. I think he would be horrified today about what we're doing now. And at that same time, he was able to talk to the committee, and that committee made a choice differently. So I'm hoping we can talk more about that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Ms. Stanfield.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Schatz, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on Google's efforts to improve the digital well-being of our users. I appreciate the opportunity to outline our programs and discuss our research in this space. My name is Maggie Stanfield. I'm a User Experience Director, and I lead the Cross-Google Digital Wellbeing Initiative. Google Digital Wellbeing Initiative is an initiative that's a top company goal, and we focus on providing users with insights about their individual tech habits and the tools to support an intentional relationship with technology. At Google, we've heard from many of our users all over the world that technology is a key contributor to their sense of well-being. It connects them to those they care about, it provides information and resources that build their sense of safety and security, and this access has democratized information and provided services for billions of users around the world. For most people, their interaction with technology is positive, and they are able to make healthy choices about screen time and overall use. But as technology becomes increasingly prevalent in our day-to-day lives, for some people, it can distract from the things that matter most. We believe technology should play a useful role in people's lives, and we've committed to helping people strike a balance that feels right for them. This is why our CEO, Sundar Pichai, first announced the Digital Wellbeing Initiative with several new features across Android, Family Link, YouTube, Gmail, all of these to help people better understand their tech usage and focus on what matters most. In 2019, we applied what we learned from users and experts and introduced a number of new features to support our Digital Wellbeing Initiative. I'd like to go into more depth about our products and tools we've developed for our users. On Android, the latest version of our mobile operating system, we added key capabilities to help users take a better balance with technology and make sure that they can focus on raising awareness of tech usage and providing controls to help them oversee their tech use. This includes a dashboard. It shows information about their time on devices. It includes app timers, so people can set time limits on specific apps. It requires a do not disturb function to silence phone calls and texts, as well as those visual interruptions that pop up. And we've introduced a new wind down feature that automatically puts the user's display into night light mode, and that reduces blue light and grayscale to remove color and ultimately the temptation to scroll. Finally, we've got a new setting called focus mode. This allows pausing specific apps and notifications that users might find distracting. On YouTube, we have similarly launched a series of updates to help our users define their own sense of well-being. This includes time-watched profiles, take-a-break reminders, the ability to disable audible notifications, and the option to combine all YouTube app notifications into one notification. We've also listened to the feedback about the YouTube recommendation system. Over the past year, we've made a number of improvements to these recommendations, raising up content from authoritative sources when people are coming to YouTube for news, as well as reducing recommendations of content that comes close to violating our policies or spreads harmful misinformation. When it comes to children, we believe the bar is even higher. That's why we've created Family Link to help parents stay in the loop as their child explores on Android. And on Android Q, parents will be able to supervise, set screen time limits and bedtimes, and remotely lock their child's device. Similarly, YouTube Kids was designed with the goal of ensuring that parents have control over the content their children watch. In order to keep the videos in the YouTube Kids app family-friendly, we use a mix of filters, user feedback, and moderators. We also offer parents the option to take full control over what their children watch by hand-selecting the content that appears in their app. We're also actively conducting our own research and engaging in important expert partnerships with independent researchers to build a better understanding of the many personal impacts of digital technology. We believe this knowledge can help shape new solutions and ultimately drive the entire industry toward creating products that support a better sense of well-being. To make sure we are evolving this strategy, we have launched a longitudinal study to better understand the effectiveness of our digital well-being tools. We believe this is just the beginning. As technology becomes more integrated into people's daily lives, we have a responsibility to ensure that our products support their digital well-being. We are committed to investing more, optimizing our products, and focusing on quality experiences. Thank you for the opportunity to outline our efforts in this space. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Stanfield. Mr. Wolfe.
Well, thanks for inviting me here today. I have to say that this is pretty far from my usual kind of venue, but I have spent my life working on the science and technology of computation and AI, and perhaps some of what I know can be helpful here today. So, first of all, here's a way I think one can kind of frame the issue. So many of the most successful internet companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter are what one can call automated content selection businesses. They ingest lots of content, and then they essentially use AI to select what to actually show to their users. How does that AI work? How can one tell if it's doing the right thing? People often assume that computers just run algorithms that someone sat down and wrote, but modern AI systems don't work that way. Instead, lots of the programs they use are actually constructed automatically, usually by learning from some massive number of examples. And if you go look inside those programs, there's usually embarrassingly little that we humans can understand in there. And here's the real problem. It's sort of a fact of basic science that if you insist on explainability, then you can't get the full power of a computational system or an AI. So if you can't open up the AI and understand what it's doing, how about sort of putting external constraints on it? Can you write a contract that says what the AI is allowed to do? Well, partly actually through my own work, we're starting to be able to formulate computational contracts, contracts that are written not in legalese, but in a precise, executable, computational language suitable for an AI to follow. But what should the contract say? I mean, what's the right answer for what should be at the top of someone's newsfeed? Or what exactly should be the algorithmic rule for balance or diversity of content? Well, as AIs start to run more and more of our world, we're going to have to develop a whole network of kind of AI laws. And it's going to be super important to get this right. Probably starting off by agreeing on sort of the right AI constitution. But it's going to be a hard thing, kind of making computational how people want the world to work. Right now, that's still in the future. But okay, so what can we do about people's concerns now about automatic content selection? I have to say that I don't see a purely technical solution. But I didn't want to come here and say that everything is impossible, especially since I personally like to spend my life solving, quotes, impossible problems. In fact, I think that if we want to do it, we actually can use technology to set up kind of a market-based solution. I've got a couple of concrete suggestions about how to do that. Both are based on giving users a choice about who to trust for the final content they see. One of the suggestions introduces what I call final ranking providers. The other introduces constraint providers. In both cases, these are third-party providers who basically insert their own little AIs into the pipeline of delivering content to users. And the point is that users can choose which of these providers they want to trust. The idea is to leverage everything that the big automated content selection businesses have, but to essentially add a new market layer. So users get to know that they're picking a particular way that content is selected for them. It also means that you get to avoid kind of all or nothing banning of content, and you don't have kind of a single point of failure for spreading bad content. And you open up a new market, potentially delivering even higher value for users. Of course, for better or worse, unless you decide to force certain content or diversity of content, which you could, people can live kind of in their own content bubbles, though importantly, they get to choose those themselves. Well, lots of technical details about everything I'm saying, as well as some deep science about what's possible and what's not. And I tried to explain a little bit more about that in my written testimony, and I'm happy to try and answer whatever questions I can here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Ms. Richardson.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Schatz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Rashida Richardson, and I'm the Director of Policy Research at the AI Now Institute at New York University, which is the first university research institute dedicated to understanding the social implications of artificial intelligence. Part of my role includes researching the increasing reliance on AI and algorithmic systems and crafting policy and legal recommendations to address and mitigate the problems we identify in our research. The use of data-driven technologies like recommendation algorithms, predictive analytics, and inferential systems are rapidly expanding in both consumer and government sectors. They determine where our children go to school, whether someone will receive Medicaid benefits, who is sent to jail before trial, which news articles we see, and which job seekers are offered an interview. Thus, they have a profound impact on our lives and require immediate attention and action by Congress. Though these technologies affect every American, they are primarily developed and deployed by a few powerful companies and therefore shaped by these companies' incentives, values, and interests. These companies have demonstrated limited insight into whether their products will harm consumers and even less experience in mitigating those harms. So while most technology companies promise that their products will lead to broad societal benefits, there's little evidence to support these claims, and in fact, mounting evidence points to the contrary. For example, IBM's Watson supercomputer was designed to improve patient outcomes, but recently internal IBM documents showed it actually provided unsafe and erroneous cancer treatment recommendations. This is just one of numerous examples that have come to light in the last year, showing the difference between the marketing companies use to sell these technologies and the stark reality of how these technologies ultimately perform. While many powerful industries pose potential harms to consumers with new products, the industry producing algorithmic and AI systems pose 3 particular risks that current laws and incentive structures fail to adequately address. The first risk is that AI systems are based on compiled data that reflect historical and existing social and economic conditions. This data is neither neutral or objective. Thus, AI systems tend to reflect and amplify cultural biases, value judgments, and social inequities. Meanwhile, most existing laws and regulations struggle to account for or adequately remedy these disparate outcomes, as they tend to focus on individual acts of discrimination and less on systemic bias or bias encoded in the development process. The second risk is that many AI systems and internet platforms are optimization systems that prioritize technology companies' monetary interests and results in products being designed to keep users engaged while often ignoring social costs, like how the product may affect non-users, environments, and markets. A non-AI example of this logic and model is a slot machine, while a recent AI-based example is the navigation system Waze, which was subject to public scrutiny following many incidents across the U.S. where the application redirected highway traffic through residential neighborhoods unequipped for the influx of vehicles, which increased accidents and risk to pedestrians. The third risk is that most of these technologies are black boxes, both technologically and legally. Technologically, they're black boxes because most of the internal workings are hidden away inside the companies. Legally, technology companies obstruct accountability efforts through claims of proprietary or trade secret legal protections, even though there is no evidence that legitimate inspection, auditing, or oversight poses any competitive risk. Controversies regarding emerging technologies are becoming increasingly common and show the harm caused by technologies optimized for narrow goals like engagement, speed, and profit at the expense of social and ethical considerations like safety and accuracy. We are at a critical moment where Congress is in a position to act on some of the most pressing issues, and by doing so, paving the way for a technological future that is safe, accountable, and equitable. With these concerns in mind, I offer the following recommendations, which are detailed in my written statement. Require technology companies to waive trade secrecy and other legal claims that hinder oversight and accountability mechanisms. Require public disclosure of technologies that are involved in any decision about consumers by name and vendor. Empower consumer protection agencies to apply truth in advertising laws. Revive the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment to perform pre-market review and post-market monitoring of technologies. Enhance whistleblower protections for technology company employees that identify unethical and unlawful uses of AI or algorithms. Require any transparency or accountability mechanisms to include a detailed reporting of the full stack supply chain, and require companies to perform and publish algorithmic impact assessments prior to public use of products and services. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson. Well, let me start, Mr. Harris, with you. As we go about crafting consumer data privacy legislation in this committee, we know that internet platforms like Google and Facebook have vast quantities of data about each user. What can these companies predict about users based on that data?
Thank you for the question. So I think there's an important connection to make between privacy and persuasion that I think often isn't linked, so maybe it's helpful to link that. With Cambridge Analytica, that was an event in which, based on your Facebook likes, based on 150 of your Facebook likes, I could predict your political personality, and then I could do things with that. The reason I described in my opening statement that this is about an increasing asymmetry of power is that without any of your data, I can predict increasing features about you using AI. There's a paper recently that with 80% accuracy, I can predict your same big 5 personality traits that Cambridge Analytica got from you without any of your data. All I have to do is look at your mouse movements and click patterns. So in other words, it's the end of the poker face. Your behavior is your signature, and we can know your political personality. Based on tweet text alone, we can actually know your political affiliation with about 80% accuracy. Computers can calculate probably that you're homosexual before you might know that you're homosexual. They can predict with 95% accuracy that you're going to quit your job, according to an IBM study. They can predict that you're pregnant. They can predict your microexpressions on your face better than a human being can. Microexpressions are your soft reactions to things that are not very visible but are invisibly visible. Computers can predict that. As you keep going and you realize that you can start to deep fake things, you can actually generate a new synthetic piece of media, a new synthetic face or synthetic message that is perfectly tuned to these characteristics. And the reason why I opened the statement by saying we have to recognize that what this is all about is a growing asymmetry of power between technology and the limits of the human mind. My favorite sociobiologist, E.O. Wilson, said the fundamental problem of humanity is that we have Paleolithic ancient emotions, we have medieval institutions, and we have godlike technology. So we're chimpanzees with nukes, and our Paleolithic brains are limited against the increasing exponential power of technology at predicting things about us. The reason why it's so important to migrate this relationship from being extractive to get things out of you to being a fiduciary is you can't have asymmetric power that is specifically designed to extract things from you. Just like you can't have, again, lawyers or doctors whose entire business model is to take everything they learned and sell it to someone else. Except in this case, the level of things that we can predict about you is far greater than actually each of those fields combined when you actually add up all the data that assembles a more and more accurate voodoo doll of each of us. And there's 2 billion voodoo dolls, by the way. There's one out of every 4 people on Earth with YouTube's and Facebook are more than 2 billion people.
Ms. Stanfield, in your prepared testimony, you note that companies like Google have a responsibility to ensure that products support users' digital well-being. Does Google use persuasive technology, meaning technology that is designed to change people's attitudes and behaviors? And if so, how do you use it? And do you believe that persuasive technology supports a user's digital well-being?
Thank you, Senator. No, we do not use persuasive technology at Google. In fact, our foremost principles are built around transparency, security, and control of our users' data. Those are the principles through which we design products at Google.
Dr. Wolfram, in your prepared testimony, you write that it's impossible, I should say, to expect any useful form of general explainability for automated content selection systems. If this is the case, what should policymakers require or expect of Internet platforms with respect to algorithm explanation or transparency?
I don't think that explaining how algorithms work is a great direction. I mean, the basic issue is if the algorithm is doing something really interesting, then you're not going to be able to explain it, because if you could explain it, it would be like saying you can jump ahead and say what it's going to do without letting it just do what it's going to do. So it's kind of a scientific issue that if you're going to have something that is explainable, then it isn't getting to use the sort of full power of computation to do what it does. So my own view, which is sort of disappointing for me as a technologist, is that you actually have to put humans in the loop. And in a sense, the thing to understand about AI is we can automate many things about how things get done. What we don't get to automate is the goals of what we want to do. The goals of what we want to do are not something that is sort of definable as an automatic thing. The goals of what we want to do is something that humans have to come up with. And so I think the most promising direction is to think about breaking kind of the AI pipeline and figuring out where you can put into that AI pipeline the right level of kind of human input. My own feeling is the most promising possibility is to kind of insert, to leave the great value that's been produced by the current automated content selection companies in ingesting large amounts of data, being able to monetize large amounts of content, et cetera, but to insert a way for users to be able to choose who they trust about what finally shows up in their news feed or in their search results or whatever else. And I think that there are technological ways to make that kind of insertion that will actually, if anything, add to the richness of potential experience for users and possibly even the financial returns for the market.
And very quickly, Ms. Richardson, what are your views about whether algorithm explanation or algorithm transparency are appropriate policy responses, and kind of response to Dr. Wolfram's.
I think they're a good interim step in that transparency is almost necessary to understand what these technologies are doing and to assess the benefits and risk. But I don't think transparency or even explainability is an end goal, because I still think you're going to need some level of legal regulation to impose liability so bad or negligent actors act in a proper manner, but also to incentivize companies to do the right thing or apply due diligence, because in a lot of cases that I cited in my written testimony, there are sort of public relations disasters that happened on the back end, and many of them could have been assessed or interpreted during the development process, but companies aren't incentivized to do that. So in some ways, transparency and explainability can give both legislators and the public more insight into these choices that companies are making to assess whether or not liability should be attached or different regulatory enforcement needs to be pursued.
Thank you. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the testifiers. First, a yes or no question. Do we need more human supervision of algorithms on online platforms? Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, although I would put some footnotes.
Sure.
Yes, with footnotes.
So I want to follow up on what Dr. Wolfram said in terms of the unbreakability of these algorithms and the lack of transparency that is sort of built into what they are foundationally. And the reason I think that's an important point that you're making, which is that you need a human circuit breaker at some point to say, no, I choose not to be fed things by an algorithm. I choose to jump off of this platform. That's one aspect of humans acting as a circuit breaker. I'm a little more interested in the human employee, either at the line level or the human employee at the supervisory level, who takes some responsibility for how these algorithms evolve over time. And Ms. Richardson, I want you to maybe speak to that question, because it seems to me as policymakers, that's where the sweet spot is to find an incentive or a requirement where these companies will not allow these algorithms to run essentially unsupervised and not even understood by the highest echelons of the company except in their output. And so, Ms. Richardson, can you help me to flesh out what that would look like in terms of enabling human supervision?
So I think it's important to understand some of the points about the power asymmetry that Mr. Harris mentioned, because I definitely do think we need a human in the loop, but we also need to be cognizant of who actually has power in those dynamics, and that you don't necessarily want a frontline employee taking full liability for a decision that or for a system that they had no input in the design or even in their current sort of position in using it. So I think it needs to go all the way up in that if you're thinking about liability or responsibility in any form, it needs to attach at those who are actually making decisions about the goals, the designs, and ultimately the implementation and use of these technologies, and then figuring out what are the right pressure points or incentive dynamics to encourage companies or those making those decisions to make the right choice that benefits society.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that none of this ends up coming to much unless the executive level of these companies feel a legal and financial responsibility to supervise these algorithms. Ms. Stanfield, I was a little confused by one thing you said. Did you say Google doesn't use persuasive technology?
That is correct, sir.
Mr. Harris, is that true?
It's complicated. Persuasion is happening all throughout the ecosystem. In my mind, by the way, this is less about accusing one company, Google or Facebook. It's about understanding that every company...
Yeah, I get that, but she's here, and,
yes.
and she just said that they don't use persuasive technology, and I'm trying to figure out, are you talking about just the Google suite of products? You're not talking about YouTube? Or are you saying in the whole alphabet pantheon of companies, you don't use persuasive technology? Because either I misunderstand your company or I misunderstand the definition of persuasive technology. Can you help me to understand what's going on here?
Sure. With respect to my response, Mr. Senator, it is related to the fact that dark patterns and persuasive technology is not core to how we design our products at Google. which are built around transparency.
Are you talking about
security, and control.
YouTube or the whole family of companies?
The whole family of companies, including YouTube.
You don't want to clarify that a little further?
We build our products with privacy, security, and control for the users. That is what we build for. And ultimately, this builds a lifelong relationship with the user, which is primary. That's our trust.
I don't know what any of that meant. Ms. Richardson, can you help me?
I think part of the challenge, as Mr. Harris mentioned, is how you're defining persuasive, and that both of us mentioned that a lot of these systems and internet platforms are a form of an optimization system, which is optimizing for certain goals, and there you could say that is a persuasive technology, which is not accounting for certain social risk, but I think there's a business incentive to not, to take a more narrow view of that definition. So I can't speak for Google because I don't work for them, but I think the reason you're confused is because you may need to clarify definitions of what is actually persuasive in the way that you're asking the question and what is Google suggesting doesn't have persuasive characteristics in their technologies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Senator Fischer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Harris, as you know, I've introduced the Detour Act with Senator Warner to curb some of the manipulative user interfaces. We want to be able to increase transparency, especially when it comes to behavioral experimentation online. Obviously, we want to make sure children are not targeted with some of the dark patterns that are out there. In your perspective, how do dark patterns thwart that user autonomy online?
Yeah. So persuasion is so invisible and so subtle. In fact, oftentimes we're criticized when you use this language or you say we're crawling down the brainstem. People think that you're overreacting, but it's a design choice. So for background, I studied at a lab called the Persuasive Technology Lab at Stanford that taught engineering students essentially about this whole field. And my friends in the class were the founders of Instagram. And Instagram as a product copied Twitter actually in the technique of what you could call a dark pattern of the number of followers that you have to get people to follow each other. So there's a follow button on each profile. And that's meant, that doesn't seem so dark. That's what's so insidious about it. It's just you're giving people a way to follow each other's behavior. But what it actually is doing is an attempt to cause you to come back every day because now you want to see, do I have more followers now than I did yesterday?
And how are these platforms then getting our personal information? How much choice do we really have? I thought the doctor's comment about the goals we want to do as humans, that we have to get involved in this. But then your introductory comments are basically, I think, telling us that everything about us is already known. So
Yeah.
It wouldn't be really hard to manipulate where our goals what they even want to be at this point, right?
And the goal is to subvert your goals. So I'll give you an example. If you say I want to delete my Facebook account, if you hit delete, it puts up a screen that says, are you sure you want to delete your Facebook account? The following friends will miss you, and it puts up faces of certain friends. Now, am I asking to know which friends will miss me? No. Does Facebook ask those friends, do I know, are they going to miss me if I leave? No. They're calculating which of the 5 faces would be most likely to get you to hit cancel and not delete your Facebook account. So that's a subtle and invisible dark pattern that's just meant to sway behavior. I think another example you're trying to get at in the opening question is if you consent to giving your data to Facebook or your location, and oftentimes there'll be a big blue button, which have 100 engineers behind the screen split testing all the different colors and variations and arrangements of where that button should be, and then a very, very, very small gray link that people don't even know is there. And so what we're calling a free human choice is a manipulated choice. And again, it's just like a magician. They're saying pick a card, any card, but in fact there's an asymmetry of power.
When you're on the internet and you're trying to look something up and you have this deal pop up on your screen, this is so irritating, and you have to hit OK to get out of it because you don't see the other choice on the screen. As you said, it's very light, it's gray, but now I know if I hit OK, this is going to go on, and whoever is going to get more and more information about me. They're really invading my privacy, but I can't get rid of this screen otherwise, unless you turn off your computer and start over. Right?
There's all sorts of ways to do this. If I'm a persuader and I really want you to hit OK on my dialogue so I can get your data, I'll wait until the day that you're in a rush to get the address to that place you're looking for, and that's the day that I'll put up the dialogue that says, hey, were you willing to get me your information? And then, of course, you're going to say, fine, yes, whatever. Because in persuasion, there's something called hot states and cold states. When you're in a hot state or an immediate impulsive state, it's very easy to persuade someone than versus when they're in a cold, calm, and reflective state. And technology can actually either manufacture or wait till you're in those hot states.
So how do we protect ourselves and our privacy, and what role does the federal government have to play in this besides getting our bill passed?
I mean, at the end of the day, the reason why we go back to the business model is it is about alignment of interests. You don't want a system of asymmetric power that is designed to manipulate people, and you're always going to have that insofar as the business model is one of manipulation as opposed to regenerative, meaning you have a subscription-style relationship. So I would say Netflix probably has many fewer dark patterns because it's in a subscription relationship with its users. When Facebook says that, you know, how else could we give people this free service? Well, it's like a priest whose entire business model is to manipulate people, saying, well, how else can I serve so many people?
Yeah.
Right. So
how do we keep our kids safe?
There's so much to that. I think what we need is a mass public awareness campaign so people understand what's going on. One thing I have learned is that if you tell people this is bad for you, they won't listen. If you tell people this is how you're being manipulated, no one wants to feel manipulated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Fischer. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for being here today. You know, I was struck by what Senator Schatz said in his opening statement. Algorithms are not only running wild, but they are running wild in secrecy. They are cloaked in secrecy in many respects from the people who are supposed to know about them. Ms. Richardson referred to the black box here. That black box is one of our greatest challenges today. And I think that we are at a time when algorithms, AI, and the exploding use of them is almost comparable to the time of the beginnings of atomic energy in this country. We now have an Atomic Energy Commission. Nobody can build bombs, nuclear bombs, in their backyard because of the dangers of nuclear fission and fusion, which is comparable, I think, to what we have here, systems that are in many respects beyond our human control and affecting our lives in very direct, extraordinarily consequential terms beyond the control of the user and maybe the builder. So on the issue of persuasive technology, I find, Ms. Stanfill, your contention that Google does not build systems with the idea of persuasive technology in mind somewhat difficult to believe, because I think Google tries to keep people glued to its screens at the very least. That persuasive technology is operative. It's part of your business model. Keep the eyeballs. It may not be persuasive technology to convert them to the far left or the far right. Some of the content may do it, but at the very least, the technology is designed to promote usage. YouTube's recommendation system has a notorious history of pushing dangerous messages and content, promoting radicalization, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Earlier this month, Senator Blackburn and I wrote to YouTube on reports that its recommendation system was promoting videos that sexualized children, effectively acting as a shepherd for pedophiles across its platform. Now, you say in your remarks that you've made changes to reduce the recommendation of content that, quote, violates our policies or spreads harmful misinformation. And according to your account, the number of views from recommendations for these videos has dropped by over 50% in the United States. I take those numbers as you've provided them. Can you tell me what specific steps you have taken to end your recommendation system's practice of promoting content that sexualizes children?
Thank you, Senator. We take our responsibility to supporting child safety online extremely seriously. Therefore, these changes are in effect, and as you stated, these have had a significant impact.
But what specifically?
Resulting in actually changing which content appears in the recommendations. So this is now classified as borderline content. That includes misinformation and child exploitation content.
You know, I am running out of time. I have so many questions, but I would like each of the witnesses to respond to the recommendations that Ms. Richardson has made, which I think are extraordinarily promising and important. I'm not going to have time to ask you about them here, but I would like the witnesses to respond in writing, if you would, please. And second, let me just observe on the topic of human supervision, I think that human supervision has to be also independent supervision. On the topic of arms control, we have a situation here where we need some kind of independent supervision, some kind of oversight, and yes, regulation. I know it's a dirty word these days in some circles, but protection will require intervention from some independent source here. I don't think trust me can work anymore. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. We appreciate that you are here, and I enjoyed visiting with you for a few minutes before the hearing began. Mr. Wolfram, I want to pick up where we had discussed in your testimony computational irreducibility. And look at that for just a moment. As we talk about this, does it make algorithmic transparency sound increasingly elusive? And would you consider that moving toward that transparency is a worthy goal, or should we be asking another question?
Yeah, I think there are different meanings to transparency. There are. If you are asking, tell me why the algorithm did this versus that, that's really hard. Mm-hmm. And if we really want to be able to answer that, we're not going to be able to have algorithms that do anything very powerful. Because in a sense, by being able to say, this is why it did that, well, we might as well just follow the path that we use to explain it, rather than have it do it what it needed to do itself.
So the transparency, what we can't do is try to get a pragmatic result.
Yeah, we can't go inside. We can't open up the hood and say, why did this happen? And that's why I think the other problem is knowing what you want to have happen. Like you say, this algorithm is bad. This algorithm gives bad recommendations. What do you mean by bad recommendations? You have to be able to define something that says, oh, the thing is biased in this way, the thing is producing content we didn't like. How do you have to be able to give a way to define those bad things.
All right. Ms. Richardson, and I can see you're making notes and want to weigh in on this, but you also talked about compiled data and encoded bias in getting the algorithm to yield a certain result. So let's say you build this algorithm and you build this box to contain this data set or to make certain that it is moving this direction. Then as that algorithm self-replicates and moves forward, does it move further that direction, or does data inform it and pull it a separate direction if you're building it to get it to yield a specific result?
So it depends on what type of technical system we're talking about, but to unpack what I was saying is the problem with a lot of these systems is they're based on data sets, which reflect all of our current conditions, which also means any imbalances in our conditions. So one of the examples that I gave in my written testimony referenced Amazon's hiring algorithm, which was found to have gender disparate outcomes, and that's because it was learning from prior hiring practices. And there's also examples of other similar hiring algorithms, one of which found that if you had the name Jared and you played lacrosse, you had a better chance of getting a job interview. And there, it's not necessarily that the correlation between your name being Jared and playing lacrosse means that you're necessarily a better employee than anyone else. It's simply looking at patterns in the underlying data, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the patterns that the system is seeing actually reflects reality, or in some cases it does, and it's not necessarily how we want to view reality, and instead shows the skews that we have in society.
Got it. Okay. Mr. Wolfram, you mentioned in your testimony there could be a single content platform but a variety of final ranking providers. Are you suggesting that it would be wise to prohibit companies from using cross-business data flows?
I'm not sure how that relates to, I mean, the thing that I think is the case is it is not necessary to have the final ranking of content. There's a lot of work that has to be done to get content ready to be finally ranked for a news feed or for search results and so on. That's a lot of heavy lifting. The choice, which is made often separately for each user, about how to finally rank content, I don't think has to be made by the same entity. And I think if you break that apart, you kind of change the balance between what is controllable by users and what is not. I don't think it's realistic to, I think, yeah. I mean, I would like to say that one of the questions about, a data set implies certain things, we don't like what that implies and so on. One of the challenges is to define what we actually want. And one of the things that's happening here is that because these are AI systems, computational systems, we have to define much more precisely what we want than we've had to do before. Okay. And so it's necessary to kind of write these computational rules, and that's a tough thing to do. And it's something which cannot be done by computer, and it can't even be necessarily done from prior data. It's something people like you guys have to decide what to do about.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would like unanimous consent to enter the letter that Senator Blumenthal and I sent earlier this month. And thank you. I know my time has expired, but I will just simply say to Ms. Stamphill that the evasiveness on answering Senator Blumenthal's question about what they are doing is inadequate when you look at the safety of children online. Just to say that you're changing the content that appears in the recommended list is inadequate. And Mr. Harris, I will submit a question to you about what we can look at on platforms for combating some of this bad behavior.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Fascinating discussion. I'd like to address an issue that I think is of profound importance to our democratic republic. And that's the fact that in order to have a vibrant democracy, you need to have an exchange of ideas and an open platform. And certainly part of the promise of the internet as it was first conceived was that we'd have this incredible universal commons where a wide range of ideas would be discussed and debated. It would be robust. And yet it seems as if we're not getting that. We're actually getting more and more siloed. Dr. Wolfram, you mentioned how people could make choices and they could live in a bubble, but at least it would be their bubble that they get to live in. But that's what we're seeing throughout our society as polarization increases. More and more folks are reverting to tribal-type behavior. Mr. Harris, you talked about our medieval institutions and Stone Age minds. Tribalism was alive and well in the past, and we're seeing advances in technology in a lot of ways bring us back into that kind of tribal behavior. So my question is, to what extent is this technology actually accelerating that, and is there a way out? Yes, Mr. Harris.
Yeah, thank you. I love this question. There's a tendency to think here that this is just human nature. Now, that's just people are polarized, and this is just playing out. It's a mirror. It's holding up a mirror to society. But what it's really doing is it's an amplifier for the worst parts of us. So in the race to the bottom of the brainstem to get attention, let's take an example like Twitter. It's calculating what is the thing that I can show you that gets the most engagement. And it turns out that outrage, moral outrage, gets the most engagement. So it was found in a study that for every word of moral outrage that you add to a tweet, it increases your retweet rate by 17%. So in other words, the polarization of our society is actually part of the business model. Another example of this is that shorter, briefer things work better in an attention economy than long, complex, nuanced ideas that take a long time to talk about. And so that's why you get 140 characters dominating our social discourse. But reality and the most important topics to us are increasingly complex, while we can say increasingly simple things about them. That automatically creates polarization because you can't say something simple about something complicated and have everybody agree with you. People will, by definition, misinterpret and hate you for it. And then it's never been easier to retweet that and generate a mob that will come after you. And this has created a call-out culture and chilling effects and a whole bunch of other subsequent effects in polarization that are amplified by the fact that these platforms are rewarded to give you the most sensational stuff. One last example of this is on YouTube. Let's say we actually equalize. I know there's people here concerned about equal representation on the left and the right in media. Let's say we get that perfectly right. As recently as just a month ago on YouTube, if you did a map of the top 15 most frequently mentioned verbs or keywords in the recommended videos, they were hates, debunks, obliterates, destroys. In other words, Jordan Peterson destroys social justice warrior in video. So that kind of thing is the background radiation that we're dosing 2 billion people with. And you can hire content moderators in English and start to handle the problem, as Ms. Stamphill said. But the problem is that 2 billion people in hundreds of languages are using these products. How many engineers at YouTube speak the 22 languages of India where there's an election coming up? So that's some context on that.
Well, there's a lot of context. Fascinating. And I'm running out of time, but I took particular note in your testimony when you talked about how technology will eat up elections. And you were referencing, I think, another writer on that issue. In the remaining brief time I have, what's your biggest concern about the 2020 elections and how technology may eat up this election coming up?
Yeah, that comment was that another example of we used to have protections that technology took away. We used to have equal price campaign ads so that it cost the same amount on a Tuesday night at 7 p.m. for any candidate to run an election. When Facebook gobbles up that part of media, it just takes away those protections. So there's now no equal pricing. In terms of what I'm worried about, I'm mostly worried about the fact that none of these problems have been solved. The business model hasn't changed, and the reason why you see a Christchurch event happen and the video just show up everywhere, or any of these examples, fundamentally there's no easy way for these platforms to address this problem because the problem is their business model. I do think there are some small interventions like fast lanes for researchers, accelerated access for people who are spotting disinformation. But the real problem, another example of software eating the world, is that instead of NATO or the Department of Defense protecting us in a global information warfare, we have a handful of 10 or 15 security engineers at Facebook and Twitter. And they were woefully unprepared, especially in the last election, and I'm worried that they still might be.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Harris, I agree with you when you say that our best line of defense as individuals is exposure. People need to understand that they are being manipulated, and a lot of this hearing has been talking about the manipulation, algorithms, artificial intelligence. I want to talk about the manipulation by human intervention, human bias. We don't allow, or we certainly put restrictions through the FCC on an individual owning their ownership of TV stations, radio stations, newspapers, because we don't want that monopoly of content in a community, much less, Facebook, Google access billions of people, hundreds of millions of Americans. So I had staff on Instagram go to the Politico account, and by the way, I have a video of this, so I'd like to enter that into the record. They hit follow, and this is what the list they were given, and this is in the exact order, and I'd ask the audience and the witnesses to just see if there's a conservative in here, or how many there are. Here's the list. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, New York Times, Huffington Post, Bernie Sanders, CNN Politics, New York Times Opinion, NPR, Economist, Nancy Pelosi, The Daily Show, Washington Post covering POTUS, NBC, Wall Street Journal. Pete Buttigieg, Time, New Yorker, Reuters, Southern Poverty Law Center, Kirsten Gillibrand, The Guardian, BBC News, ACLU, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Beto O'Rourke, Real Time with Bill Maher, C-SPAN, SNL, Pete Souza, UN, Guardian, HuffPost Women's, Late Show with Stephen Colbert, MoveOn.org, Washington Post Opinion, USA Today, New Yorker, Women's March, Late Night with Seth Meyers, The Hill, CBS, Justin Trudeau, it goes on. These were 5 conservative staff members. If they're really algorithms shuffling the content that they might actually want to, or that they would agree with, you would expect you'd see maybe Fox News, Breitbart, Newsmax. You might even see like a really big name like Donald Trump, and there wasn't. So my question is, who's producing that list? Is that Instagram? Is that Politico site? How is that being generated? I have a hard time feeling that's generated or being manipulated by an algorithm or by AI.
I don't know any. I'd be really curious to know what the click pattern was. That, in other words, you open up an Instagram account and it's blank, and you're saying that if you just ask who do I follow or from a
you
empty
hit
account,
follow, and you're given suggestions for you to follow.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly have no idea how Instagram ranks those things, but I'd be very curious to know what the original clicks were that produced that list.
So, can anybody else explain that? I mean, I don't believe that's AI trying to give content to a conservative staff member of things they may want to read. I mean, this to me looks like Instagram, if they're actually the ones producing that list, trying to push a political bias. Mr. Wolfram, you seem to want to weigh in.
The thing that will happen is, if there's no other information, it will tend to be just where there is the most content or where the most people on the platform in general have clicked. So it may simply be a statement in that particular case that I'm really speculating, but that the users of that platform tend to like those things. And so if there's no other information...
So again, that you'd have to assume then that the vast majority of users of Instagram are liberal progressives.
That might be evidence of that.
Ms. Stanfield, is that what your understanding would be?
Thank you, Senator.
By the way, we could probably do it on Google, too. It'd be interesting, but...
I can't speak for Twitter. I can speak for Google's stance just generally with respect to AI, which is we build products for everyone. So we've got systems in place to ensure no bias is introduced.
But we have, I mean, you won't deny the fact that there are plenty of instances of content being pulled off of conservative websites and having to repair the damage of that, correct? I mean, what's happening here?
Thank you, Senator. I wanted to quickly remind everyone that I am a user experience director and I work on digital well-being, which is a program to ensure that users have a balanced relationship with tech. So that's
Mr. Harris, what's happening on here? Because again, I think conservatives have legitimate concern that content is being pushed from a liberal progressive standpoint to the vast majority of users of these social sites.
Yeah, I mean, I really wish I could comment, but I don't know much about where that's happening, so...
Ms. Richardson?
So there has been some research on this, and it showed that when you're looking at engagement levels, there is no partisan disparities. In fact, it's equal. So I agree with Dr. Wolfram in that what you may have saw was just what was trending. Like even in the list, you mentioned Southern Poverty Law Center, and they were simply trending because their executive director was fired. So that may just be a result of the news, not necessarily the organization. But it's also important to understand that research has also shown that when there is any type of disparity on partisan lines, it's usually dealing with the veracity of the underlying content, and that's more of a content moderation issue rather than what you're shown.
Okay, anyway, I'd like to get that video entered into the record, and we'll keep looking into this.
Without objection, and to the senator from Wisconsin's point, I think if you Google yourself, you'll find most of the things that pop up right away are going to be from news organizations that tend to be to the left. I mean, I have had that experience as well, and it seems like if that actually was based upon a neutral algorithm or some other form of artificial intelligence, that since you're the user and since they know your habits and patterns, you might see something instead of from the New York Times pop up from Fox News or the Wall Street Journal. That to me has always been hard to explain.
Well, let's work together to try and get that explanation, because it's a valid concern.
Senator Tester, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all the folks who have testified here today. Ms. Stanfield, does YouTube have access to personal data on a user's Gmail account?
Thank you, Senator. I am an expert in digital well-being at Google, so I'm sorry, I don't know that with depth, and I don't want to get out of my depth. So I can take that back for folks to answer.
Okay, so when it comes to Google search history, you wouldn't know that either?
I'm sorry, Senator. I'm not an expert in search, and I don't want to get out of my depth, but I can take it back.
Okay, all right. Let me see if I can ask a question that you can answer. Does YouTube, do you know if YouTube uses personal data in shaping recommendations?
Thank you, Senator. I can tell you that I know that YouTube has done a lot of work to ensure that they're improving recommendations. I do not know about privacy and data because that is not necessarily core to digital well-being. I focus on helping provide users with balanced technology usage. So in YouTube, that includes a time watch profile. It includes a reminder where if you want to set a time limit, you'll get a reminder.
And
ultimately, we give folks power to basically control their usage.
I understand what you're saying. I think that what I'm concerned about is that if, and it doesn't matter if you're talking Google or Facebook or Twitter or whoever it is, has access to personal information, which I believe they do. Mr. Harris, do you think they do?
I wish that I really knew the exact answer to your
Does
question.
anybody know the answer to that question?
I mean, the general premise is that with more personal access to information that Google has, they can provide better recommendations is usually the talking point.
That's correct.
And the business model, because they're competing for who can predict better what will keep your attention.
My eyes in that website?
Yeah, they would use as much information as they can, and usually the way that they get around this is by giving you an option to opt out, but of course the default is usually to opt in, and that's, I think, what's leading to what you're talking about.
Yes, so I am 62 years old, getting older every minute the more this conversation goes on. But I will tell you that it never ceases to amaze me that my grandkids, the oldest one is about 15 or 16, goes down to about 8, when we're on the farm, is absolutely glued to this, absolutely glued to it, to the point where if I want to get any work out of them, I have to threaten them, okay? Because they're riveted. So, Ms. Stanfield, do you guys, when you're in your leadership meetings, do you actually talk about addictive nature of this? Because it's as addictive as a cigarette or more. And do you talk about the addictive nature? Do you talk about what you can do to stop it? I will tell you that I'm probably going to be dead and gone, and I'll probably be thankful for it when all this shit comes to fruition. Because I think that this scares me to death. Senator Johnson can talk about the conservative websites. You guys could literally sit down at your board meeting, I believe, and determine who's going to be the next president of the United States. I personally believe that you have that capacity. Now, I could be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong. And so, do any of the other folks that are here? I'll go with Ms. Robinson. Do you see it the same way, or am I overreacting to a situation that I don't know enough about?
No, I think your concerns are real in that the business model that most of these companies are using and most of the optimization systems are built to keep us engaged with provocative material that can skew in the directions that your concerns
And I don't know your history, but do you think that the board of directors for any of these companies actually sit down and talk about impacts that I'm concerned about, or are they talking about how they continue to use what they've been doing to maximize their profit margin?
I don't think they're talking about the risk you're concerned about, and I don't even think that's happening in the product development level, and that's in part because a lot of teams are siloed, so I doubt these conversations are happening in a holistic way to sort of address your concerns, which is
that's good, and I don't want to get in a fist fight on this panel, but Ms. Stanfield, are the conversations you have since you couldn't answer the previous ones, indicate that she's right, the conversations are siloed. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct, sir,
So
Senator.
then why can't you answer my questions?
I can answer the question with respect to how we think about digital well-being at Google. It's a cross-company OKR, so it's actually a goal that we work on across the company. So I have the novel duty of connecting those dots, but we are doing that, and we have incentive to make sure that we make progress.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you all for being here, and hopefully you all leave friends, because I know that there's certain senators, including myself, just tried to pit you against one another. That's not intentional. I think that this is really serious. I have exactly the opposite opinion that Senator Johnson has, and that I think there's a lot of driving to the conservative side. So it shows you that when humans get involved in this, we're going to screw it up. But by the same token, there needs to be those circuit breakers that Senator Schatz talked about. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you to the old geezer from Montana. Senator Rosen.
All of you for being here today. I have so many questions as a former software developer and systems analyst, and so I see this really as I have three issues and one question. So the issue one really is going to be there's a combination happening of machine language, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing all coming together that exponentially increases the capacity of predictive analytics. It grows on itself. This is what it's meant to do. Issue two, the monetization, the data brokering of these analytics and the bias in all areas in regards to the monetization of this data. And then, as you spoke earlier, where does the ultimate liability lie? With the scientists that craft the algorithm, with the computer that potentiates the data and the algorithm, or the company or persons who monetize the end use of the data for whatever means, right? So three big issues, many more, but on its face. But my question today is on transparency. So many sectors, we require transparency. We're used to it every day. Think about this for potential harm. So every day you go to the grocery store, the market, a convenience store. In the food industry, we have required nutrition labeling on every single item. It clearly discloses our nutrition content. We even have it on menus now, calorie count, oh my, maybe I won't have that Alfredo, right? You'll go for the salad. And so we've accepted this. All of our companies have done this. It's a state of, there isn't any food that doesn't have a label. Maybe there is some food, but basically we have it. So to empower consumers, how do you think we could address some of this transparency that maybe at the end of the day we're all talking about in regards to this, these algorithms, the data, what happens to it, how we deal with it? It's overwhelming.
I think with respect to things like nutrition labels, we have the advantage that we're using 150-year-old science to say what the chemistry of what is contained in a food is. Things like computation and AI are a bit of a different kind of science, and they have this feature that this phenomenon of computational irreducibility happens, and it's not possible to just give a quick summary of what the effect of this computation is going to be.
But we know, I know, having written algorithms for myself, I have kind of an expected outcome. I have a goal in there. You talk about no goals. There is a goal.
Yes.
Whether you meet it or not, whether you exceed it or not, whether you fail or not, there is a goal when you write an algorithm to give somebody who's asking you for this data.
The
what they want to
confusing
do
thing
with it.
is that the practice of software development has changed, and it's changed in machine learning and
That's
in AI.
correct. And so they can create their own goals. Machine learning
It's
does.
not quite its own goals. It's rather that when you write an algorithm, I expect, when I started using computers a ridiculously long time ago also, you would write a small program and you would know what every line of code was supposed to do.
With quantum computing, you don't. But you still should have some ability to control the outcome.
Well, I think my feeling is that rather than saying, yes, you can put constraints on the outcome. The question is, how do you describe those constraints? And you have to essentially have something like a program to describe those constraints. Let's say you want to say, we want to have balanced treatment. We want to have...
So let's take it out of technology and just talk about transparency in a way we can all understand. Can we put it in English terms that we're going to make your data well-being, how you use it, do you sleep, don't you sleep, how many hours a day, think about your Fitbit, who is it going to? We can bring it down to those English language parameters that people understand.
Well, I think some parts of it you could. I think the part that you cannot is when you say, we're going to make this give unbiased treatment of, let's say, political directions or something.
I'm not even talking unbiased in political directions. There's going to be bias in age, in sex, in race, and ethnicity. There's inherent bias in everything. So that given, you can still have other conversations.
I mean, my feeling is that rather than saying we'll have a nutrition label-like thing that says what this algorithm is doing, I think the better strategy is to say, let's give some third party the ability to be the brand that finally decides what you see. Just like with different newspapers, you can decide to see your news through the Wall Street Journal or through the New York Times or whatever else.
Who's ultimately liable if people get hurt by the monetization of this data or the data brokering of some of it?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that it will help to break apart the underlying platform. Something like Facebook, for example, you kind of have to use it. There's a network effect. And it's not the case that, you can't say, let's break Facebook into 1,000 different Facebooks, and you can pick which one you want to use. That's not really an option. But what you can do is to say, when there's a news feed that's being delivered, is everybody seeing a news feed from with the same set of values, with the same brand, or not? And I think the realistic thing is to say, have separate providers for that final news feed, for example. I think that's a possible direction. There's a few other possibilities. And that's a way, and so your sort of label says, this is the such and such branded news feed, and people then get a sense of, is that the one I like? Is that the one that's doing something reasonable? If it's not, they'll just, as a market matter, reject it. That's my thought.
I think I'm way over my time. We can all have a big conversation here. I'll submit more questions for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen, and my apologies to the senator from New Mexico, who I missed. You were up actually before the senator from Nevada, but Senator Udall is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the panel. A very, very important topic here. Mr. Harris, I'm particularly concerned about the radicalizing effect that algorithms can have on young children. And it's been mentioned here today in several questions. I'd like to drill down a little deeper on that. Children can inadvertently stumble on extremist material in a number of ways. By searching for terms they don't know are loaded with subtext, by clicking on shocking content designed to catch the eye, by getting unsolicited recommendations on content designed to engage their attention and maximize their viewing time. It's a story told over and over by parents who don't understand how their children have suddenly become engaged with the alt-right and white nationalist groups or other extremist organizations. Can you provide more detail how young people are uniquely impacted by these persuasive technologies and the consequences if we don't address this issue promptly and effectively?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, this is one of the issues that most concerns me. As I think Senator Schatz mentioned at the beginning, there's evidence that in the last month, even as recently as that, keeping in mind that these issues have been reported on for years now, there was a pattern identified by YouTube that young girls who had taken videos of themselves dancing in front of cameras were linked in usage patterns to other videos like that went further and further into that realm. And that was just identified by YouTube, as a supercomputer, as a pattern. It's a pattern of this is a kind of pathway that tends to be highly engaging. The way that we tend to describe this, if you imagine a spectrum on YouTube, on my left side there's the calm Walter Cronkite section of YouTube. On the right-hand side there's Crazy Town. UFOs, conspiracy theories, Bigfoot, whatever. And if you take a human being and you could drop them anywhere. You could drop them in the calm section, or you could drop them in Crazy Town. But if I'm YouTube and I want you to watch more, which direction from there am I going to send you? I'm never going to send you to the calm section. I'm always going to send you towards Crazy Town. So now you imagine 2 billion people like an ant colony of humanity, and it's tilting the playing field towards the crazy stuff. And the specific examples of this: a year ago, a teen girl who looked at a dieting video on YouTube would be recommended anorexia videos because that was the more extreme thing to show. The voodoo doll that looked like a teen girl, there's all these voodoo dolls that look like that, and the next thing to show is anorexia. If you looked at a NASA moon landing, it would show flat Earth conspiracy theories, which it recommended hundreds of millions of times before being taken down recently. I wrote down another example. 50% of white nationalists in a Bellingcat study had said that it was YouTube that had red-pilled them. Red-pilling is the term for, the opening of the mind. The best predictor of whether you'll believe in a conspiracy theory is whether I can get you to believe in one conspiracy theory. Because one conspiracy sort of opens up the mind and makes you doubt and question things and get really paranoid. And the problem is that YouTube is doing this in mass, and it's created sort of 2 billion personalized Truman shows. Right? Each channel has that radicalizing direction. And if you think about it from an accountability perspective, back when we had Janet Jackson on one side of the TV screen at the Super Bowl and we had 60 million Americans on the other, we had a 5-second TV delay and a bunch of humans in the loop for a reason. But what happens when you have 2 billion Truman shows, 2 billion possible Janet Jacksons, and 2 billion people on the other end? It's a digital Frankenstein that's really hard to control. And so that's, I think, the way that we need to see it. From there, we can talk about how to regulate it.
Yeah. And Ms. Stamfill, you've heard him just describe what Google does with young people. What responsibility does Google have if its algorithms are recommending harmful videos to a child or a young adult that they otherwise would not have viewed?
Thank you, Senator. Unfortunately, the research and information cited by Mr. Harris is not accurate. It doesn't reflect current policies nor the current algorithm. So what the team has done in effort to make sure these advancements are made, they have taken such content out of recommendations, for instance. That limits the views by more than 50%.
So are you saying you don't have any responsibility?
Thank you, Senator.
Because clearly young people are being directed towards this kind of material. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you, Senator. YouTube is doing everything that it can to ensure child safety online and works with a number of organizations to do so and will continue to do so.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Harris?
I don't, because I know the researchers who are unpaid who stay up till 3 in the morning trying to scrape the data sets to show what these actual results are, and it's only through huge amounts of public pressure that incrementally they've tackled bit by bit, issue by issue, bits and pieces of it. And if they were truly acting in responsibility, they would be doing so preemptively without the unpaid researchers staying up till 3 in the morning doing that work.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the witnesses being here today. Very important issues that we're all struggling with. Let me ask Ms. Stamfill. I had the opportunity to engage in a couple rounds of questions with Mr. Zuckerberg from Facebook when he was here. One of the questions I asked, which I think we're all trying to struggle with, is this issue of what you, when I say you, Google or Facebook, what you are, right? You think there's this notion that you're a tech company, but some of us think you might be the world's biggest publisher. I think about 140 million people get their news from Facebook. You, when it combines Google and Facebook, I think it's about somewhere north of 80% of Americans get their news. So what are you? Are you a publisher? Are you a tech company? And are you responsible for your content? I think that's another really important issue. Mark Zuckerberg did say he was responsible for their content, but at the same time he said that they're a tech company, not a publisher. And as you know, whether you are one or the other is really critical, almost the threshold issue in terms of how and to what degree you would be regulated by federal law. So which one are you?
Thank you, Senator. As I might remind everybody, I am a user experience director for Google, and so I support our digital well-being initiative. With that said, I know we're a tech company. That's the extent to which I know this definition that you're speaking of.
So do you feel you're responsible for the content that comes from Google on your websites when people do searches?
Thank you, Senator. As I mentioned, this is a bit out of my area of expertise as the digital well-being expert. I would defer to my colleagues to answer that specific question.
Well, maybe we can take those questions for the record.
Of course.
Anyone else have a thought on that pretty important threshold question?
Yeah, I think so.
Mr. Harris?
If it's okay if I jump in. Thank
sure.
you, Senator. The issue here is that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
It's all about Section 230.
It's all about Section 230. Has obviously made it so that the platforms are not responsible for any content that is on them, which freed them up to do what we've created today. The problem is if is YouTube a publisher? Well, they're not generating the content, they're not paying journalists, they're not doing that, but they are recommending things. And I think that we need a new class between, the New York Times is responsible if they say something that defames someone else, that reaches a certain 100 million or so people. When YouTube recommends flat earth conspiracy theories hundreds of millions of times, and if you consider that 70% of YouTube's traffic is driven by recommendations, meaning driven by what they are recommending, what an algorithm is choosing to put in front of the eyeballs of a person, if you were to backwards derive a motto, it would be, with great power comes no responsibility.
Well, let me follow up on that, two things real quick, because I want to make sure I don't run out of time here. It's a good line of questioning. When I asked Mr. Zuckerberg, he actually said they were responsible for their content. That was in a hearing like this. Now that actually starts to get close to being a publisher, from my perspective. So I don't know what Google's answer is or others, but I think it's an important question. And Mr. Harris, you just mentioned something that I actually think is a really important question. I don't know if some of you saw Tim Cook's commencement speech at Stanford a couple weeks ago. I happened to be there and saw it. I thought it was quite interesting. But he was talking about all the great innovations from Silicon Valley. But then he said, quote, "Lately it seems this industry is becoming better known for a less noble innovation, the belief that you can claim credit without accepting responsibility." Then he talked about a lot of the challenges, and then he said, "It feels a bit crazy that anyone should have to say this, but if you've built a chaos factory, you can't dodge responsibility for the chaos. Taking responsibility means having the courage to think things through." So I'm going to open this up, kind of final question, and maybe we'll start with you, Mr. Harris. What do you think he was getting at? It was a little bit generalized, but he obviously put a lot of thought into his commencement speech at Stanford. This notion of building things, creating things, and then going, whoa, I'm not responsible for that. What's he getting at? And then I'll open that up to any other witnesses. I thought it was a good speech, but I'd like your views on it.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what everyone's been saying on this panel, that these things have become digital Frankensteins that are terraforming the world in their image, whether it's the mental health of children or our politics and our political discourse, and without taking responsibility for taking over the public square. So again, it comes back to...
And who do you think is responsible?
I think we have to have the platforms be responsible for when they take over election advertising. They're responsible for protecting elections. When they take over mental health of kids or Saturday morning, they're responsible for protecting Saturday morning.
Anyone else have a view on the quotes I gave from Tim Cook's speech? Mr. Wolfe.
I think one of the questions is, what do you want to have happen? That is, what, when you say something bad is happening, what is it's giving the wrong recommendations. By what definition of wrong? What is the, who is deciding, who is kind of the moral arbiter? I mean, if I was running one of these automated content selection companies, my company does something different, I would not want to be kind of a moral arbiter for the world, which is what's effectively having to happen when there's sort of decisions being made about what content will be delivered, what will not be being delivered. My feeling is the right thing to have happen is to break that apart, to have a more market-based approach, to have third parties be the ones who are responsible for sort of that final decision about what content is delivered to what users, so that the platforms can do what they do very well, which is the kind of large-scale engineering, large-scale monetization of content, that somebody else gets to be, that somebody that users can choose from, a third party gets to be the one who is deciding sort of the final ranking of content shown to particular users, so users can get brand allegiance to particular content providers that they want and not to other ones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. YouTube is far and away the top website for kids today. Research shows that a whopping 80% of 6 through 12-year-olds use YouTube on a daily basis. But when kids go on YouTube, far too often they encounter inappropriate and disturbing video clips that no child should ever see. In some instances, when kids click to view cartoons and characters in their favorite games, they find themselves watching material promoting self-harm and even suicide. In other cases, kids have opened videos featuring beloved Disney princesses and all of a sudden see a sexually explicit scene. Videos like this shouldn't be accessible to children at all, let alone systematically served to children. Mr. Harris, can you explain how, once a child consumes one inappropriate YouTube video, the website's algorithms begin to prompt the child to watch more harmful content of that sort?
Yes, thank you, Senator. So if you watch a video about a topic, let's say it's that cartoon character, the Hulk or something like that, YouTube picks up some pattern that maybe Hulk videos are interesting to you. The problem is there's a dark market of people who you're referencing in that long article that was very famous, who actually generate content that, based on the most viewed videos, they'll look at the thumbnails and say, oh, there's a Hulk in that video, there's a Spider-Man in that video, and then they have machines actually manufacture free-generated content and then upload it to YouTube with machines and tag it in such a way that it gets recommended near those content items. Mm-hmm. And YouTube is trying to maximize traffic for each of these publishers. So when these machines upload the content, it tries to dose them with some views and saying, well, maybe this video is really good. And it ends up gathering millions and millions of views because kids, quote unquote, like them. And I think the key thing going on here is that, as I said in the opening statement, this is about an asymmetry of power being masked as an equal relationship, because technology companies claim we're giving you what you want,
so
as
opposed to... So for the 6 to 12-year-old, they just keep getting fed the next video, the next video, the next video.
Correct.
And there's no way that that can be a good thing for our country over a long period of time.
Especially when you realize the asymmetry that YouTube's pointing a supercomputer at that child's brain and calculating.
An 8-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, yeah,
right.
Just wrong. So clearly the way the websites are designed can pose serious harm to children, and that's why in the coming weeks I will be introducing the Kids Internet Design and Safety Act, the KIDS Act. Specifically, my bill will combat amplification of inappropriate and harmful content on the internet, online design features like autoplay that coerce children and create bad habits, and commercialization and marketing that manipulates kids and push them into consumer culture. So to each of today's witnesses, will you commit to working with me to enact strong rules that tackle the design features and underlying issues that make the internet unsafe for kids? Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Ms. Stanfield.
Yes.
It's a terrific goal, but it's not particularly my expertise.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Stanfield, Ms. Stanfield, recent reporting suggests that YouTube is considering significant changes to its platform, including ending autoplay for children's videos, so that when one video ends, another doesn't immediately begin, hooking the child onto long viewing sessions. A call for an end to autoplay for kids. Can you confirm that to this committee that YouTube is getting rid of that feature?
Thank you, Senator. I cannot confirm that as a representative from Digital Wellbeing. Thank you. I can get back to you, though.
I think it's important, and I think it's very important that that happen voluntarily or through federal legislation to make sure that the internet is a healthier place for kids. And Senators Blunt and Schatz and myself, Senator Sass, Senator Collins, Senator Bennett, are working on a bipartisan Children and Media Research Advancement Act that will commission a 5-year, $95 million research initiative at the National Institutes of Health to investigate the impact of tech on kids. It will produce research to shed light on the cognitive, physical, and socio-emotional impacts of technology on kids. I look forward on that legislation to working with everyone at this table as well so that we can design legislation and ultimately a program. I know that Google has endorsed the Camera Act. Ms. Stanfield, can you talk to this issue?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I can speak to the fact that we have endorsed the Camera Act and look forward to working with you on further regulation.
Okay, same thing for you, Mr. Harris?
We've also endorsed it with Center for Humane Technology, yeah.
Thank you. So I just think we're late as a nation to this subject, but I don't think that we have an option. We have to make sure that there are enforceable protections for the children of our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Young.
I thank our panel for being here. I thought I'd ask a question about concerns that many have, and I expect concerns will grow about AI becoming a black box where it's unclear exactly how certain platforms make decisions. In recent years, deep learning has proved very powerful at solving problems and has been widely deployed for tasks like image captioning, voice recognition, and language translation. As the technology advances, there is great hope for AI to diagnose deadly diseases, calculate multi-million-dollar trading decisions, and implement successful autonomous innovations for transportation and other sectors. Nonetheless, the intellectual power of AI has received public scrutiny and has become unsettling for some futurists. Eventually, society might cross a threshold in which using AI requires a leap of faith. In other words, AI might become, as they say, a black box where it might be impossible to tell how an AI that has internalized massive amounts of data is making its decisions through its neural network, and by extension, it might be impossible to tell how those decisions impact the psyche, the perceptions, the human understanding, and perhaps even the behavior of an individual. In early April, the European Union released final ethical guidelines calling for what it calls trustworthy AI. The guidelines aren't meant to be or intend to interfere with policies or regulations, but instead offer a loose framework for stakeholders to implement their recommendations. One of the key guidelines relates to transparency and the ability for AI systems to explain their capabilities, limitations, and decision-making. However, if the improvement of AI requires, for example, more complexity, imposing transparency requirements will be equivalent to a prohibition on innovation. So I will open this question to the entire panel, but my hope is that Dr. Wolfman, I'm sorry, sir, you can begin. Can you tell this committee the best ways for Congress to collaborate with the tech industry to ensure AI system accountability without hindering innovation? And specifically, should Congress implement industry requirements or guidelines for best practices?
It's a complicated issue. Yes. I think that it varies from industry to industry. I think in the case of what we're talking about here, internet automated content selection, I think that the right thing to do is to insert a kind of level of human control into what is being delivered, but not in the sense of taking apart the details of an AI algorithm, but making the structure of the industry be such that there is some human choice injected into what's being delivered to people. I think the bigger story is we need to understand how we're going to make laws that can be specified in computational form and applied to AIs. We're used to writing laws in English, basically, and we're used to being able to say, write down some words and then have people discuss whether they're following those words or not. When it comes to computational systems, that won't work. Things are happening too quickly, they're happening too often. You need something where you're specifying computationally, this is what you want to have happen, and then the system can perfectly well be set up to automatically follow those computational rules or computational laws. The challenge is to create those computational rules, and that's something we're just not yet experienced with. It's something that we're starting to see computational contracts as a practical thing in the world of blockchain and so on, but we don't yet know how you would specify some of the things that we want to specify as rules for how our systems work. We don't yet know how to do that computationally.
Are you familiar with the EU's approach to develop ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI?
I'm not familiar with those specifics.
Are any of the other panelists in? Okay. Well, then perhaps that's a model we could look at. Perhaps that would be ill-advised. So for stakeholders that may be watching these proceedings or listening to them, they can tell me. Do others have thoughts?
So in my written comments, I outlined a number of transparency mechanisms that could help address some of your concerns, and some of the recommendations, one specifically, which was the last one, is we suggested that companies create an algorithmic impact assessment, and that framework, which we initially wrote for government use, can actually be applied in the private sector, and we built the framework from learning from different assessments. So in the US, we use environmental impact assessments, which allows for robust conversation about development projects and their impact on the environment, but also in the EU, which is one of the reference points that we use, they have a data protection impact assessment, and that's something that's done both in government and in the private sector. But the difference here, and why I think it's important for Congress to take action, is what we're suggesting is something that's actually public, so we can have a discourse about whether this is a technological tool that has a net benefit for society or something that's too risky that shouldn't be available.
I'll be attentive to your proposal. Do you mind if we work with you, dialogue, if we have any questions about it?
Yes, very much.
All right, thank you. Others have any thoughts? It's okay if you don't. Okay. Sounds like we have a lot of work to do, industry, working with other stakeholders to make sure that we don't act impulsively, but we also don't neglect this area of public policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Cruz.
Ms. Stamphill, a lot of Americans have concerns that big tech media companies, and Google in particular, are engaged in political censorship and bias. As you know, Google enjoys a special immunity from liability under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. The predicate for that immunity was that Google and other big tech media companies would be neutral public fora. Does Google consider itself a neutral public forum?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, it does.
Okay. Are you familiar with a report that was released yesterday from Veritas that included a whistleblower from within Google, that included videos from a senior executive at Google, and that included documents that are purportedly internal PowerPoint documents from Google?
Yes, I heard about that report in industry news.
Have you seen the report?
No, I have not.
So you didn't review the report to prepare for this hearing?
It's been a busy day, and I have a day job, which is digital well-being at Google, so I'm trying to make sure I keep the trains on the
sorry,
tracks.
this hearing is impinging on your day job.
It's a great opportunity. Thank you. I really
Well,
appreciate
one of the
it.
things in that report, and I would recommend people interested in political bias at Google watch the entire report and judge for yourself. There's a video from a woman, Jen Janai. It's a secret video that was recorded. Jen Janai, as I understand it, is the head of, quote, responsible innovation for Google. Are you familiar with Ms. Janai?
I work in user experience, and I believe that AI group is somebody we worked with on the AI principles, but it's a big company, and I don't work directly with Jen.
Do you know her or no?
I do not know Jen.
Okay. As I understand it, she is shown in the video saying, and this is a quote, Elizabeth Warren is saying that we should break up Google. And like, I love her, but she's very misguided. Like, that will not make it better. It will make it worse. Because all these smaller companies who don't have the same resources that we do will be charged with preventing the next Trump situation. It's like a small company cannot do that. Do you think it's Google's job to, quote, prevent the next Trump situation?
Thank you, Senator. I don't agree with that. No, sir.
So a different individual, a whistleblower identified simply as an insider at Google with knowledge of the algorithm, is quoted on the same report as saying, Google, quote, is bent on never letting somebody like Donald Trump come to power again. Do you think it's Google's job to make sure, quote, somebody like Donald Trump never comes to power again?
No, sir, I don't think that is Google's job. And we build for everyone, including every single religious belief, every single demographic, every single region, and certainly every political affiliation.
Well, I have to say that that certainly does not appear to be the case. Of the senior executives at Google, do you know of a single one who voted for Donald Trump?
Thank you, Senator. I'm a user experience director, and I work on Google Digital Wellbeing, and I can tell you we have diverse views,
It's
but
a
I
simple
can't.
question. Do you know of anyone who voted for Trump? Of the senior
I definitely
executives,
know of people who voted for Trump.
of the senior executives at Google?
I don't talk politics with my workmate.
Is that a no?
Sorry, is that a no to what?
Do you know of any senior executives, even a single senior executive at the company who voted for Donald Trump?
As the digital well-being expert, I don't think this is in my purview to comment on
So
political
you don't know that.
affiliations.
That's all right. You don't have to know.
I definitely don't know.
I can tell you what the public records show. The public records show that in 2016, Google employees gave to the Hillary Clinton campaign $1.315 million. That's a lot of money. Care to venture how much they gave to the Trump campaign?
I would have no idea, sir.
Well, the nice thing is it's a round number, $0.00. Not a penny, according to the public reports. Let's talk about one of the PowerPoints that was leaked. The Veritas report has Google internally saying, I propose we make machine learning intentionally human-centered and intervene for fairness. Is this document accurate?
Thank you, sir. I don't know about this document, so I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to respond to the committee in writing afterwards as to whether this PowerPoint and the other documents that are included in the Veritas report, whether those documents are accurate. And I recognize that your lawyers may want to write explanation. You're welcome to write all the explanation that you want, but I also want a simple, clear answer. Is this an accurate document that was generated by Google? Do you agree with the sentiment expressed in this document?
No, sir, I do not.
Let me read you another, also in this report. It indicates that Google, according to this whistleblower, deliberately makes recommendations if someone is searching for conservative commentators, deliberately shifts the recommendation, so instead of recommending other conservative commentators, it recommends organizations like CNN or MSNBC or left-leaning political outlets. Is that occurring?
Thank you, sir. I can't comment on search algorithms or recommendations given my purview as the digital well-being lead. I can take that back to my team, though.
So is it part of digital well-being for search recommendations to reflect where the user wants to go rather than deliberately shifting where they want to go?
Thank you, sir. As a user experience professional, we focus on delivering on user goals. So we try to get out of the way and get them on the task at hand.
So a final question. One of these documents that was leaked explains what Google is doing, and it has a series of steps. Training data are collected and classified, algorithms are programmed, media are filtered, ranked, aggregated, and guaranteed, and that ends with people, parentheses, like us, are programmed. Does Google view its job as programming people with search results?
Thank you, Senator. I can't speak for the whole entire company, but I can tell you that we make sure that we put our users first in our design?
Well, I think these questions raise very serious, these documents raise very serious questions about political bias at the company.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Schatz, anything to wrap up with?
Just a quick statement and then a question. I don't want the working of the refs to be left unresponded to, and I won't go into great detail except to say that there are members of Congress who use the working of the refs to terrify Google and Facebook and Twitter executives so that they don't take action in taking down extreme content, false content, polarizing content, contra their own rules of engagement. And so I don't want the fact that the Democratic side of the aisle is trying to engage in good faith on this public policy matter and not work the refs. Allow the message to be sent to the leadership of these companies that they have to respond to this bad faith accusation every time we have any conversation about what to do in tech policy. My final question for you, this will be the last time I leap to your defense, Ms. Stanfill. Did you say privacy and data is not core to digital well-being?
Thank you, sir. I might have misstated how that's being phrased. So what I meant...
What do you mean to say?
Oh, I mean to say that there is a team that focuses day in, day out on privacy, security, control as it relates to user data,
right, but
that is outside of my area.
But so you're talking sort of bureaucratically, and I don't mean that as a pejorative. You're talking about the way the company is organized. I'm saying, aren't privacy and data core to digital well-being?
I see. Sorry, I didn't understand that point, Senator. In retrospect, what I believe is that it is inherent in our digital well-being principles that we focus on the user, and that requires that we focus on privacy, security, control of their data.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. And to be fair, I think both sides work the refs. But let me just ask a follow-on question. I appreciate Senator Blackburn's line of questioning from earlier, which may highlight some of the limits on transparency. As we have sort of started, I think, with our opening statements today, are trying to look at ways that in this new world we can provide a level of transparency. Maybe you said it's going to be very difficult in terms of explainability of AI, but just understanding a little bit better how to provide users the information they need to make educated decisions about how they interact with a platform's services. So the question is, might it make sense to let users effectively flip a switch to see the difference between a filtered, algorithm-based presentation and an unfiltered presentation?
Try commenting. I mean, there are already, for example, search services that aggregate user searches and feed them en masse to search engines like Bing, so that you're effectively seeing the results of a generic search, independent of specific information about you. Works okay. There are things for which it doesn't work well. I think that this idea of, you flip a switch, I think that is probably not going to have great results, because I think there will be, unfortunately, great motivation to have the case where the switch is flipped to not give user information, give bad results. I'm not sure how you would motivate giving good results in that case. I think that it's also, it's sort of when you think about that switch, you can think about a whole array of other kinds of switches, and I think pretty soon it gets pretty confusing for users to decide, which switches they flip for what. Do they give location information but not this information? Do they give that information, not that information? I mean, my own feeling is the most promising direction is to let some third party be inserted who will develop a brand. There might be 20 of these third parties. It might be like newspapers where people can pick, do they want news from this place, that place, another place. To insert third parties and have more of a market situation where you're relying on the trust that you have in that third party to determine what you're seeing, rather than saying the user will have precise, detailed control. I mean, much as I would like to see more users be more engaged in kind of computational thinking and understanding what's happening inside computational systems, I don't think this is a case where that's going to work in practice.
All right. Anybody else? Mr. Richardson.
So I think the issue with the flip the switch hypothetical is users need to be aware of the trade-offs, and currently so many users are used to the conveniences of existing platforms. So if there's currently a privacy-preserving platform called DuckDuckGo, which doesn't take your information and it is gives you search results. But if you're used to seeing the most immediate result at the top, DuckDuckGo, even though it's privacy-preserving, may not be the choice that all users would use, but they're not hyper aware of what are the trade-offs of them giving that information to the provider. So I think while I understand the reason you're giving that metaphor, it's important for users to understand both the practices of a platform and also to understand the trade-offs, where if they want a more privacy-preserving service, what are they losing or gaining from that?
Chairs.
Yeah, the issue is also that users, I think has already been mentioned, will quote-unquote prefer, because it saves them time and energy, the summarized feed that's algorithmically filtering it down for them. Even Jack Dorsey at Twitter has said that when you show people the reverse chronological feed versus the algorithmic one, it saves them time and it's more relevant to do the algorithmic one. So even if there's a switch, most people will quote-unquote prefer that one. And I think they have to be aware of the trade-offs, and we have to have a notion of what fair really means there. What I'm most concerned about is the fact that this is still fairness with respect to increasingly fragmented truth that debases the information environment that a democracy depends on of shared truth or shared narrative. But that's more.
I'd like to comment on that issue. I mean, I think the challenge is when you want to sort of have a single shared truth, the question is who gets to decide what that truth is. And I think that's, the question is that decided within a single company, implemented using AI algorithms? Is that decided in some more, market kind of way by a collection of companies? I think it makes more sense in kind of the American way of doing things to imagine that it's decided by a whole selection of companies rather than being something that is burnt into a platform that, for example, has sort of become universal through network effects and so on.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. This is a very complicated subject, but one I think that your testimony and responses have helped shed some light on, and certainly will shape our thinking in terms of how we proceed. But there's definitely a lot of food for thought there. So thank you very much for your time and for your input today. We'll leave the hearing record open for a couple of weeks, and we'll ask senators if they have questions for the record to submit those, and we would ask all of you, if you can, to get those responses back as quickly as possible so that we can include them in the final hearing record. I think with that, we are adjourned. Thanks.